Margaret sat alone in her modest home on the quiet edge of Portland, where the evergreens swayed slowly in the wind and the streets rarely echoed with more than bird song or distant traffic. At 78, she had settled into a gentle rhythm of solitude. The rooms of her house still held remnants of a shared life. Books her husband once read, the clock he insisted on winding by hand, the kitchen table where their conversations once lingered past midnight. 12 years had passed since his death, and while time had dulled the sharpness of loss, it had never fully erased the absence. That morning was ordinary in every way. Margaret folded laundry in the living room, watered her small collection of houseplants, and stepped outside to collect the mail. She flipped through the usual stack, flyers, bills, a postcard from a neighbor's vacation, until her fingers stopped on a cream-colored envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. She hadn't seen it in over a decade, but she recognized it instantly. It was his. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The ink was fresh, not yellowed or faded. The postmark confirmed it had been sent just days ago. The letter spoke of a quiet afternoon at the lake house in 1979, a day when the two of them had sat barefoot on the dock, drinking lemonade and talking about nothing in particular. It mentioned the color of her dress, the way the sun reflected off the water, the scent of pine in the air. All details he had never written down before. She remembered that day clearly, but they had never discussed it in such exact terms. He couldn't have described it like that unless he had been there, unless he had just lived it. Margaret didn't feel fear. She felt a soft ache in her chest, something between nostalgia and disbelief. The letter didn't feel like a prank. It didn't carry malice. If anything, it felt like a whisper from a part of her life she thought was sealed away forever. She sat in her armchair for hours, the letter in her lap, the world moving on outside her window, while something unexplainable settled gently inside her. A few days later, Margaret found a second envelope in the mailbox. Just like the first, it bore her late husband's handwriting, crisp and unmistakable. This time, the letter referenced the day their daughter had left for college, a bitter-sweet milestone that had lingered in Margaret's heart for years. The words were gentle, reflective, as if written from the edge of that very moment. They described her tears that evening, the silence that filled the house, and the way her husband had wanted to comfort her, but chose instead to give her space. As the days passed, more letters followed. They arrived irregularly, but always on a date that held meaning. An anniversary, the day of a miscarriage long ago, the moment when they had nearly separated but chose instead to hold on. Each letter seemed to draw from memories too specific to be coincidence. Margaret began pulling out old calendars and notebooks, searching for connections. The dates lined up with moments her husband had marked privately, in his own hand, across decades. Notes in the margins, underlined words, sometimes just a small M beside a date, almost imperceptible. She started keeping a journal again, trying to track the rhythm of the letters, searching for a pattern that might explain their arrival. The envelopes bore no return address. The stamps were recent. The handwriting never wavered. Margaret took one of them to the local post office, hoping someone could tell her something, anything about the sender. The clerk was kind but baffled. The envelope had entered the system like any other piece of mail. No special processing, no indication of tampering. Margaret left the post office with more questions than answers. She held the letter in her hand as she walked back home, the cool wind brushing against her skin. A part of her wanted a rational explanation, but another part, deeper, quieter, was beginning to wonder if reason had anything to do with this at all. Margaret decided it was time to tell someone. She invited her daughter over one Sunday afternoon, laid the letters out on the kitchen table, and waited while she read through them in silence. Her daughter's reaction was cautious, restrained. She spoke gently, as if treading around a wound, suggesting that Margaret might be misremembering or idealizing things from the past. She offered theories about memory, grief, and the tricks the mind could play after years of solitude. Margaret listened, nodding, but the quiet certainty inside her only deepened. After her daughter left, Margaret grew more determined. She began visiting neighbors, asking if anyone had noticed someone unusual around her mailbox. Most hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. She called a few of her husband's old friends, now scattered across the state, but none of them had sent the letters or knew of anyone who would. Some were surprised to hear his name again. Others confessed they had long stopped thinking of him at all. One afternoon during a walk through town, she stopped by the old post office where her husband had once picked up mail every Saturday morning. There she met Mr. Delaney, a retired postal worker who now came in occasionally to help with sorting. He had known Margaret's husband and greeted her with warmth and curiosity. When she explained what had been happening, he grew quiet. Then he said something unexpected. A few weeks ago, he had seen a young man standing by the mailbox outside Margaret's house. It had been early in the morning, before the trucks made their rounds. The boy had been tall, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a wool coat too big for him. Mr. Delaney had assumed he was just another college kid passing through. But he remembered something else. The young man hadn't just dropped the letter and walked away. He had stood there for a moment, looking at the house with a strange expression, something between sorrow and longing. Margaret asked him to describe the boy in more detail. Mr. Delaney recalled that he had kept his head slightly bowed, as if trying not to be seen. His movements had been gentle, deliberate, and his eyes, he said, had seemed impossibly sad. That image lingered with Margaret long after she returned home. The letters had always felt personal, but now they also felt connected to someone real, someone who was walking through her world unnoticed, carrying pieces of a past only she seemed to recognize. Margaret laid the letters out across her bed, arranging them in the order they had arrived. There were 9 in total. Each envelope, creased and worn from her repeated handling, carried the same gentle handwriting that she had memorized years ago. The ink had not faded, but her memory had, until now. She began rereading the letters from the beginning, slowly, as if turning the pages of a diary she had never known existed. The first letter spoke of a quiet Sunday afternoon at the lake, a moment she had nearly forgotten. He had written about her laughter, about the way she skipped stones without ever looking at the ripples. The details pulled her back, not just to the scene, but to how she had felt in that hour, carefree, unguarded, loved. As she read on, she realized that each letter recounted a specific memory, not just from his perspective, but with a startling intimacy. Moments of silence during arguments, his observations during her illness, his regret at not being able to articulate his fears as he aged, all of it was there. Her own life began to take on new colors, painted not only by her recollection, but by the unseen parts of his experience. One letter described a winter morning when they had quarreled, then sat in silence over breakfast. She had believed that day to be ordinary, even cold, but in his words it became something else, a moment where he had studied her face, understood her sadness, and wished he had reached for her hand. She had never known. She went searching through old boxes in the attic, and there she found one of his notebooks, nearly hidden beneath photo albums. It was filled with small entries, many of them brief, some unfinished. Most matched the dates of the letters. He had been writing for years, quietly without sharing. She understood then that the letters weren't written for the world. They were written for her, for a time when she would be ready to receive them. Each word she read softened a wound she hadn't known was still open. His way of seeing her, even at her most stubborn or distant, gave her permission to look back at her life with gentler eyes. The regrets that once held her breathless at night began to loosen. In the quiet of her room, surrounded by pieces of her own history, Margaret felt herself slowly returning, not to who she had been, but to someone more whole, more forgiving. Margaret held the letter longer than usual. It mentioned a place she hadn't thought about in years, the public library on Elm Street, where her husband had spent quiet afternoons, volunteering after retirement. The letter described the scent of old pages, the hum of the overhead lights, and the view from the window where he used to sit. A memory returned to her of waiting for him there once, watching him shelve books with deliberate care. On a bright but cold Tuesday, she took the bus across town and walked the familiar steps up to the entrance. The library had changed only slightly. The front desk was new, the chairs rearranged, but the quiet still lingered like a familiar perfume. She spoke with the librarian, explained she was looking for someone who might know about her husband's time there. They directed her to a back room where digitization work was being done. Inside, a young man with dark, curly hair and soft eyes sat in front of a scanner. His name was Jamie. When Margaret introduced herself and mentioned her husband's name, his face lit up with recognition. He said he had come across a collection of old personal writings while sorting through a box of uncatalogued donations, letters written decades ago but never sent. They were dated and folded with care, marked with small notes in the margins. He had been drawn to them by their tenderness and sadness. Jamie explained that he'd been moved by the writing and decided to send the letters on the dates mentioned, using return addresses from old envelopes also found in the box. There was no plan beyond that, only a sense that the words deserved to find their way to the person they were meant for. He hadn't known if the recipient was still alive. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying a weight Margaret recognized. He, too, had recently lost someone, his mother. Sorting the letters had been a kind of ritual, a way to feel connected to someone else's grief, someone else's love story. When he saw her name appear in the records tied to one of the addresses, he had hoped his intuition was right. Margaret felt a strange stillness as he spoke. The mystery that had enveloped her for weeks now gently unraveled, not into a grand revelation, but into something tender and human. A stranger, moved by empathy and timing, had become a bridge between past and present. In Jamie's gesture, she saw not coincidence, but a quiet act of grace. The final letter arrived on a cold morning, just one day before Christmas. The envelope was the same as the others, unmarked except for her name written in the familiar looping script. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the soft sound of carols playing faintly from a distant radio. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, knowing somehow that this one would be different. Inside, the words were brief but full. Her husband thanked her for the years, for the patience, for the laughter they had shared even when the world felt heavy. He wrote of watching her grow older from a distance he could not define, of his hope that she had felt him near. There was a quiet plea at the end, that she stop searching, stop wondering how the letters had come. He asked her simply to accept them as they were, a gift, a final touch. Folded within the paper was a photograph, worn but lovingly preserved. It was from decades ago, a black and white shot of the two of them sitting on the porch swing, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. On the back, in his unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "You were always my home." Margaret held the photo to her chest. A soft smile formed on her face. Not of joy exactly, but of peace. The fire crackled gently in the hearth behind her. Outside the window, snow began to fall, layering the world in silence. She closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone.